Hello, y'all. It's Dr. G. And the last time we spoke, we talked about the election of 1800, a contest so vicious and fraught with crisis that Jefferson himself would later call it the Revolution of 1800, quote, as real a revolution in the principles of our government as that of 76 was in its form, end quote. It marked the first peaceful transfer of power between rival political parties in American history, a moment that seemed to affirm the promise of the new republic. But what kind of republic was it? Thomas Paine had famously called America an asylum for liberty. But as the new century dawned, who was welcome in that asylum? Today we explore the promises and the paradoxes of the Jeffersonian era. We'll see a nation that doubles in size with the stroke of a pen, even as its president questions his own authority with which to do so. We'll witness the rise of a powerful pan-Indian resistance movement in the West and a second brutal war with Great Britain. And through it all, we'll confront the central agonizing contradiction of the age, the expansion of liberty for some, built on the violent dispossession and enslavement of others. This is the story of the early republic. So let's go. Thomas Jefferson came to the presidency in 1801 promising to restore the Republican experiment and check the growth of government power. But his administration was immediately confronted with the explosive issue that would haunt the entire new nation, slavery. And nothing brought that issue into sharper focus than two events that horrified and terrified white Americans, especially those living in the South. The first was the Haitian Revolution, and the second was Gabriel's Rebellion. The Haitian Revolution had begun in 1791, and this was the largest and the most successful slave revolt in history. For a decade, enslaved people in the French colony of Saint-Domingue fought for their freedom. They defeated the French, the Spanish, and British armies, and were finally able to establish the independent Black Republic of Haiti in 1804. For enslaved people in the United States, Haiti was a beacon of hope, a powerful symbol of Black liberation, throwing off the shackles of slavery. But for American slaveholders, it was a waking nightmare. Jefferson himself, though a supporter of the French Revolution, feared the, quote, specter of slave revolt and the contagion, end quote, of Black freedom spreading to American shores. His administration pursued a policy to isolate Haiti, refusing to recognize its independence for fear of encouraging similar uprisings at home. Those fears would soon seem to be realized in the summer of 1800, right before Jefferson's election. In Henrico County, Virginia, an enslaved blacksmith named Gabriel organized one of the most sophisticated slave conspiracies in American history. Gabriel's plan was to march on Richmond, seize the state armory, and take Governor James Monroe hostage and demand an end to slavery in Virginia. His plot was explicitly inspired by the language within the American Revolution and the Haitian Revolution. According to the trial testimony of one conspirator, Gabriel planned to carry a flag emblazoned with the words, quote, death or liberty. Another conspirator, when captured, reportedly declared, quote, I have nothing more to offer than what George Washington would have had to offer had he been taken by the British and put to trial, end quote. The plot was betrayed just hours before it was set to motion, and a torrential rainstorm washed out the roads, preventing the conspirators from gathering. In the aftermath, Virginian authorities executed Gabriel and 25 of his followers. The rebellion failed, but as our textbook notes, it taught Virginia's white residents two terrifying lessons. First, it proved that enslaved Black Virginians were capable of preparing and carrying out a violent revolution, one they avoided, luckily. And two, it shattered white supremacist assumptions about Black intellectual inferiority. And lastly, it demonstrated that white efforts to suppress news of other slave revolts had ultimately failed. The ghost of Gabriel and the shadow of Haiti would loom large over the politics of the early republic. The fear of slave rebellion led not to a questioning of slavery as a system itself, but rather to a hardening of racial ideologies and new laws. This period saw the rise of scientific racism, an attempt to use the language of science to justify slavery and white supremacy. Even Thomas Jefferson, that great champion of liberty, was deeply entangled in this. A few decades earlier, in his 1788 book, Notes on the State of Virginia, Jefferson speculated on the, quote, real distinctions which nature has made between black and white people. In his own words, he said this, quote, comparing them by their faculties of memory, reason, and imagination, it appears to me that in memory they are equal to whites, in reason much inferior, and that in imagination they are dull, tasteless, and anomalous. I advance it therefore as a suspicion only that the blacks, whether originally a distinct race or made distinct by time and circumstances, are inferior to the whites in the endowments of both body and mind. End quote. That is a chilling, racist passage. Jefferson admits it is only a suspicion, sure, but by publishing it, he gave that idea the immense prestige of his name and intellectual power to the cause of racism. It's a powerful reminder that the Enlightenment's focus on reason could be used not only to liberate, but also to oppress. And this emerging racial science was powerfully challenged by black intellectuals of the time, especially by a man named Benjamin Banneker. He was a free black astronomer, he was a mathematician and a surveyor. And in 1791, Banneker sent a copy of his almanac to Jefferson, along with a letter directly confronting the Secretary of State's hypocrisy. Quote, Sir, I have long been convinced that if your love for yourself and for those inestimable laws which preserve to you the rights of human nature was founded on sincerity, you could not but be solicitous that every individual of whatever distinction or color might with you equally enjoy the blessings thereof. But, sir, how pitiable it is to reflect that although you were so fully convinced of the benevolence of the Father of mankind, that you should at the same time counteract his mercies in detaining by fraud and violence so numerous a part of my brethren under groaning captivity and cruel oppression. End quote. While black Americans were fighting for their basic humanity, white women were carving out a new but still limited role in the Republic. The ideology of Republican motherhood held that women's primary political role was to raise virtuous sons who would become good citizens of the new nation. This idea, in one sense, elevated the importance of the domestic sphere, but at the same time, it confined women to it. As historian Linda Kerber has shown, the Republican mother was to be, quote, citizen, but not really a constituent, end quote. This new role did, however, create a demand for female education. If women were to be the primary educators of future citizens, then they, of course, would need to be educated themselves. And this led to the founding of new female academies. The letters of women from this period, like those of Eliza Southgate Bone, deeply reveal a yearning for intellectual engagement. Bone wrote to her cousin, lamenting, quote, the inequality of privilege between the sexes, end quote, and argued that a cultivated mind would lead to, quote, stability and uniformity in the female character. Yet even as she championed education, she also revealed the powerful social pressures of her time, observing that, quote, not one woman in 100 marries for love, end quote. In the New Republic, it seemed, it only offered new roles, but not a fundamental reordering of the power. When Thomas Jefferson took the oath of office on March 4, 1801, it was a moment of profound significance. After the bitter and divisive election, a peaceful transfer of power from the Federalist Party to the Democratic Republicans was a testament to the resilience of the new young nation's constitutional system. But Jefferson's presidency itself would mark a dramatic shift in style and substance. He rejected the formal trappings of the Washington and Adams administrations. In fact, he walked to his own inauguration. He answered the door to the president's house himself. He even hosted informal dinners. But the changes were more than just symbolic. True to his principles of limited government, he worked to slash taxes. He cut the national debt and dramatically reduced the size of the army and the navy. His vision was for a frugal agrarian republic. But in a great historical irony, this champion of small government and strict constitutional interpretations would soon make a decision that would stretch the powers of the presidency beyond anything the Federalists had even ever imagined. To understand why, we need to actually move back to Europe. In 1800, Spain secretly ceded the vast Louisiana territory, including the vital port of New Orleans or Nolens, back to France, which was now under the rule of the ambitious Napoleon Bonaparte. For Jefferson, this was a geopolitical nightmare. As he wrote to his minister in France, Robert Livingston, in 1802, quote, "There is on the globe one single spot, the possessor of which is our natural and habitual enemy. It is New Orleans, through which the produce of 3/8 of our territory must pass to market." End quote. French control of New Orleans threatened to choke off American commerce on the Mississippi River and might one day eventually lead to war. Jefferson dispatched James Monroe to join Livingston in Paris, authorizing them to offer up to $10 million for New Orleans and West Florida. But when they arrived, they were met with a stunning offer. Napoleon, his plans for a new world empire having been thwarted by the slave revolt and its success in Haiti, and facing a renewed war on the horizon with Britain, offered to sell the entire Louisiana territory for $15 million. It was a deal of a lifetime, and it doubled the size of the United States for pennies an acre. But for Jefferson, it posed a profound constitutional crisis. As a strict constructionist, he believed that the federal government only had powers explicitly granted to it in the Constitution. Nowhere in the Constitution did it give the president the power to purchase foreign territory. He confessed this dilemma in a letter to Senator John Breckinridge of Kentucky, quote, "The Constitution has made no provision for our holding foreign territory, still less for incorporating foreign territory into our Union. The executive have done an act beyond the Constitution. The legislature must ratify and pay for it, and throw themselves on their country for doing for them unauthorized what we know they would have done for themselves had they been in a situation to do it." End quote. Jefferson initially believed a constitutional amendment was necessary to authorize the purchase, but he feared that the slow, cumbersome amendment process would give Napoleon time to change his mind. Urged by his advisors like the Treasury Secretary Albert Gallatin, who argued the power to acquire territory was inherent in the treaty-making powers assigned to the executive, Jefferson ultimately set aside his constitutional strictness. He rationalized his decision by comparing himself to a guardian who invests his ward's money in an important territory, trusting that the ward, upon coming of age, will approve the actions taken for his own good. In October 1803, the Senate ratified the treaty, and the United States had doubled its size. Even before the purchase was finalized, Jefferson was planning an expedition to explore the vast and, to him, unknown territory. He chose his personal secretary, Meriwether Lewis, and an army officer, William Clark, to lead the Corps of Discovery. Their mission was part scientific, part commercial, and part geopolitical. Jefferson instructed them to find a water route to the Pacific for the purposes of commerce, to document the plants, the animals, and the geography of the region, and to establish trade and friendly relations with the Native Americans they encountered. For over 2 years, from 1804 to 1806, The expedition traveled thousands of miles from St. Louis to the Pacific Ocean and back. Their success was almost entirely dependent on the help that they received from more than 50 Native American groups that they met along the way. These groups were crucial to their success. They provided the Corps with food, shelter, guides, and critical and crucial knowledge of the landscape they encountered. The most famous of these helpers was the Lemhi Shoshone woman Sacagawea, who served as an interpreter and whose very presence with her infant son signaled to other groups that this was a peaceful mission. The journals kept by Lewis and Clark provide an invaluable, if one-sided, record of these encounters, detailing complex negotiations, cultural exchanges, and moments of tension, like when their near-violent standoff with the Lakota Sioux and the deadly skirmish with a group of Blackfeet warriors. The expedition overall was a triumph of exploration, but it was also the leading edge of an American expansion that would once again have catastrophic consequences for Native American peoples, this time in the Mid and West. Jefferson's vision of an empire of liberty was also an empire of expansion, and one that continued to put relentless pressure on Native American lands. In the Ohio Valley, this pressure gave rise to one of the most powerful resistance movements in American history, led by two Shawnee brothers, Tecumseh and Tenskwatawa. Tenskwatawa, known as the Prophet, was a spiritual leader. In 1805, he had a vision in which the, quote, Master of Life commanded him to preach a message of cultural revitalization to all Native Americans. He urged them to reject all American ways, alcohol, European-style clothing, the idea of private property, and return to their traditional customs. His message spread like wildfire, attracting thousands of followers from different groups to his new settlement, Prophetstown, in what is now Indiana. His brother, Tecumseh, was a brilliant warrior and political strategist. He took his brother's religious message and transformed it into a powerful political movement. Traveling from the Great Lakes to the Gulf Coast, Tecumseh worked to build a pan-Indian military alliance to resist further American expansion. His core argument, which he delivered in a powerful speech to the governor of the Indiana Territory, William Henry Harrison, in 1810, was that the land belonged to all Native Americans in common and that no single group had the right to sell it. Quote, "The way and the only way to check and to stop this evil is for all the red men to unite in claiming a common and equal right in the land, as it was first and should be yet. For it never was divided, but belongs to all for the use of each. For no part has a right to sell, even to each other, much less to strangers, those who want all and will not do with less." End quote. In another speech, he warned other groups of the fate that awaited them if they failed to unite now. Quote, "Sleep no longer, O Choctaws and Chickasaws, in false security and delusive hopes. We will not soon be driven from our respective countries and the graves of our ancestors? Will not the bones of our dead be plowed up and their graves be turned into fields? Shall we calmly wait until they become so numerous that we will no longer be able to resist oppression? I know you will cry with me, never, never." End quote. Tecumseh's Confederation posed a serious threat to United States ambitions. In November 1811, while Tecumseh was in the South recruiting allies, Governor Harrison marched an army of 1,000 men on Prophetstown. Tenskwatawa, against Tecumseh's orders, attacked Harrison's forces. The resulting battle was the Battle of Tippecanoe, and this was a brutal 2-hour fight that ended with the Americans driving off the Native American warriors and burning Prophetstown to the ground. The defeat shattered the Prophet's prestige and it broke the back of the Confederacy. For Tecumseh, it was a devastating blow, and it pushed him and his remaining followers into a formal alliance with the British, just as a new war between the British and the United States was about to begin. Historians sometimes call the War of 1812 America's second war for independence, and they do so for good reason. For years, the United States had been caught in the middle of a massive global conflict between Britain and Napoleonic France. The British Royal Navy was desperate for sailors, and it routinely practiced something called impressment, which meant they boarded American ships and forced American sailors into the British service. This was not only a profound insult to American sovereignty, it actually put people into war. At the same time, the British were continuing to support and arm Native American resistance movements in the West, like Tecumseh's Confederacy. A new generation of politicians in Congress, known as the War Hawks, led by men like Henry Clay of Kentucky and John C. Calhoun of South Carolina, clamored for another war against Britain. They argued that American honor and economic independence was at stake. In June of 1812, President James Madison, who was Jefferson's successor, asked Congress for a declaration of war, and what becomes known now as Mr. Madison's War began. This was a messy, often disastrous affair for the United States. An attempted invasion of Canada failed miserably, but a small American navy achieved some stunning victories at sea, the most famous of these being that the U.S. Constitution's defeat of the HMS Guerriere, a victory that earned the American ship its famous nickname, Old Ironsides. By 1814, with Napoleon defeated in Europe, Britain was able to turn its full attention now to the American War, and they launched a three-pronged attack. One of those prongs was aimed directly at the Chesapeake Bay. In August 1814, British forces landed in Maryland. They routed the American militia at the Battle of Bladensburg, and they marched unopposed into the new capital at Washington, D.C. What follows is one of the most humiliating moments in American history. In retaliation for an earlier American raid that had burned the Canadian capital of York, British troops systematically burned Washington's public buildings to the ground, including the Capitol and the President's house. An eyewitness, George Glegg, a British officer, described the scene, quote, "The blazing of houses, ships, and stores, the report of exploding magazines, and the clash of falling roofs informed them as they proceeded of what was going forward. You can conceive nothing finer than the sight which met them as they drew near to the town. The sky was brilliantly illuminated by the different conflagrations, and the dark red light was thrown upon the roads, sufficient to permit each man to view distinctly his comrade's face." End quote. First Lady Dolly Madison famously stayed behind until the last possible moment, saving cabinet papers and the iconic Gilbert Stuart portrait of George Washington before fleeing the city. From Washington, the British moved on to their next target, the much more commercially important city of Baltimore. But Baltimore itself was fortified and ready. The city's defenses were anchored by Fort McHenry. For 25 hours, the British fleet bombarded the fort, but its defenders refused to surrender. A young American lawyer named Francis Scott Key, who was being held on a British ship, watched the bombardment through the night. At dawn, when he saw the American flag still flying over the fort, he was inspired to write a poem that he called The Defense of Fort McHenry. Set to the popular British drinking tune, it would later become America's national anthem, the Star-Spangled Banner. The final and most infamous battle of the war was fought, ironically, after the peace treaty had already been signed. In January 1815, a massive veteran British army attacked New Orleans, which was defended by a motley crew of American regulars, a militia from Kentucky and one from Tennessee, as well as free black soldiers and even some pirates, all under the command of a tough frontier general named Andrew Jackson. The British launched a frontal assault on Jackson's well-entrenched position. The result was a slaughter. In less than an hour, the British suffered 2,000 plus casualties, including their commanding general, while the Americans lost fewer than 100 men. A soldier from Tennessee described the scene, quote, "When the smoke had cleared away and we could obtain a fair view of the field, it looked, at first glance, like a sea of blood. It was not blood itself which gave it this appearance, but the red coats in which the British soldiers were dressed. Straight out before our position, the field was entirely covered with prostrate bodies." End quote. The Battle of New Orleans, which happened after the war had been over, was a stunning American victory. It had no effect on the outcome of the war, but it had a profound effect on the American psyche, believing that they had now won the war. It created a new national hero as well, Andrew Jackson, who would later ride this to the presidency. And it fueled a powerful wave of American nationalism and the era of good feelings. The War of 1812 was a disaster for the Federalist Party. From the very beginning, they had opposed the war, which was deeply unpopular in their New England stronghold. In late 1814, a group of New England Federalists met in secret at the Hartford Convention to air their grievances. They proposed a series of constitutional amendments designed to protect New England's interests, including a one-term limit for the president and a two-thirds vote in Congress for declaring war or admitting new states. But their timing could have not come at a worse time. Just as their emissaries arrived in Washington to present their demands, news of Jackson's victory at New Orleans and the signing of the Treaty of Ghent, which ended the war, happened. Suddenly, the Federalists looked like foolish, disloyal, and even traitorous and treasonous old men. The party collapsed after this, and it never fully recovered. The collapse of the Federalists ushered in a period of one-party rule under the Democratic Republicans, a time that a Boston newspaper dubbed as the, quote, era of good feelings. This period was marked by a surge in American nationalism. The war, despite its many failures, like the burning of the White House, which is why it's white, by the way, it convinced many Americans that they could stand up to a European power. It had, as our textbook puts it, quote, cultivated a profound sense of union among a diverse and divided people, end quote. This new sense of national confidence found its most forceful expression in 1823 in what became known as the Monroe Doctrine. President James Monroe, in his annual address to Congress, laid out a bold new foreign policy for the United States. Alarmed by the possibility that European powers might once again try to reconquer newly independent nations in Latin America, Monroe declared that the Western Hemisphere was off limits to future European colonization. Quote, the American continents are henceforth not to be considered as subjects for future colonization by any European powers. We should consider any attempt on their part to extend their system to any portion of this hemisphere as dangerous to our peace and safety. The Monroe Doctrine was a stunning declaration, one that the United States might not have been able to enforce. The young United States had little power at the time to actually make good on this promise, but it was a powerful statement of a new American identity, confident, assertive, and seeing itself as the dominant power in the Western Hemisphere. So the early republic was a period of profound transformation and contradiction. It began in an era of Jefferson's revolution and his vision of a limited agrarian republic. But it was also an era that saw the dramatic expansion of federal power with the Louisiana Purchase, the brutal realities of a second war with Britain, and the rise of a new assertive American nationalism. And through it all, the unresolved questions of the revolution continued to linger. The nation that Thomas Paine had called an asylum for liberty was also a nation that was systematically dispossessing Native Americans of their land and building its prosperity on the backs of slaves. The era of good feelings would prove to be short-lived. The very forces unleashed in this period, westward expansion, the growth of a national market, and the deepening divide over slavery, would soon shatter the illusion of national unity. Next time, we'll explore the market revolution, and we'll look at the rise of factories, the building of canals and railroads, and the profound social and economic changes that would transform the lives of ordinary Americans and then set the stage for the rise of a new kind of politics under Andrew Jackson. So, this is me, Dr. G, saying, I'll see y'all in the past.